The mansion loomed like a grotesque monument to the past, its towering structure covered in ivy and rot, isolated from the world at the end of a forgotten dirt road. Nathan Carter, a seasoned investigator of the paranormal, stood outside the mansion with his team, feeling the weight of its dark history pressing down on them. His breath was visible in the crisp autumn air, though it wasn't cold enough for that. The others, Elena, Greg, and Marcus, shared uneasy glances, their enthusiasm from earlier in the day now dampened by the mansion's oppressive presence. "This place has seen death," Marcus murmured, staring at the boarded-up windows. "You can almost smell it." Nathan nodded, his mind drifting to the research he'd done. The mansion had been abandoned for over 50 years, ever since the last family who lived there vanished without a trace. Before that, rumors swirled of mysterious deaths, suicides, and disappearances. Local legends painted the house as cursed, haunted by restless spirits that refused to let the living intrude. Nathan adjusted the camera strapped to his chest, signaling the start of their investigation. "All right, let's stick to the plan. We'll split into pairs. Elena, you're with me. Greg, you and Marcus cover the west wing. We record everything. If anything goes wrong, we regroup immediately." The front door creaked open with a long, sorrowful groan as Nathan pushed it, the sound reverberating through the silent air. The inside of the mansion was worse than he expected. Dust and cobwebs covered every inch, but there was an unsettling sense of order, as though the house had been waiting for them. Furniture stood in place, untouched by time, and strange symbols were scratched into the walls, the language unfamiliar and arcane. Nathan exchanged a glance with Elena, who was already filming. Her usually steady hands trembled slightly. They stepped forward together, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. As they ventured deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop. The air grew thick with something unseen, and it felt as though eyes were watching them from every corner. "Did you feel that?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathan had. It was like the air itself was moving, brushing past him as if something, or someone, had just walked by. He swallowed, forcing himself to remain calm. "Keep recording." The deeper they went, the more intense the sensation became. The corridors twisted and turned, leading them into rooms that felt as though they shouldn't exist in the structure of the house. Some were lavishly decorated, as though the mansion's owners had never left. Others were empty, save for broken furniture and eerie child-sized handprints on the walls, stained dark and faded over time. They reached a large ballroom at the center of the house, its once beautiful chandelier hanging precariously by a single chain, swaying gently as though recently disturbed. It was here that Nathan felt it, the unmistakable presence of something malicious. "I don't like this," Elena muttered, her voice shaking. She pointed toward the far end of the room. "Look." At first, Nathan didn't see anything, but then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall silhouette, its features obscured by the darkness. It stood completely still, watching them. "Is that?" Elena's voice faltered, trailing off. Nathan's heart raced, but his instincts told him not to run. He fumbled for the walkie-talkie. "Greg, Marcus, we've got something. Meet us in the ballroom. Now." The figure remained still, but something in its presence felt wrong, unnatural. The temperature dropped further, and Nathan could see his breath again, though his body wasn't registering the cold. It felt as if the house itself was exhaling, breathing in tandem with their every step. Suddenly, the figure moved, stepping forward into the dim light cast by their flashlights. It was a man, or at least it had once been. His face was gaunt and pale, eyes sunken deep into his skull. He wore old, tattered clothes that belonged to another era. But the most chilling detail was his smile, a wide, unnatural grin stretched across his face, as though it had been carved into his skin. "Nathan," Elena gasped, taking a step back. Her camera continued to roll, capturing the impossible sight before them. The man's lips parted, and a voice emerged, broken and rasping, like it hadn't been used in years. "Welcome home." Nathan felt a cold dread grip his spine as the lights flickered, and the mansion seemed to groan in response. The walls began to tremble, dust raining down from the ceiling. A loud crash came from behind them, Greg and Marcus, who burst into the room, out of breath, their faces pale with fear. "There's something in the West Wing," Greg panted. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned to retreat, the front doors slammed shut with a thunderous bang, locking them inside. Nathan turned back to the figure, but it was gone, leaving only the echo of its eerie greeting in his mind. The mansion had woken up. The silence that followed the slamming of the door was deafening. Nathan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. The house groaned again, as though settling into a new posture, one of hunger, of anticipation. Greg, Marcus, and Elena stood frozen, eyes wide with panic. "Everyone stay calm," Nathan said, though his voice sounded hollow, even to himself. He was trying to maintain control, but it was clear the house wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. And it didn't want them to leave. Greg moved toward the door, tugging at the rusted handle. It didn't budge. "This is insane," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "We have to get out of here, Nathan. This isn't right. Nothing about this is right." "We will," Nathan assured him, though he had no idea how. His mind raced, scrambling for answers. The figure they had seen wasn't human, at least not anymore. In the house, it had locked them in. But why? Was it toying with them, waiting for something? "Let's head back through the West Wing," Marcus suggested, though his tone was anything but confident. "There might be another exit we didn't see. Or we could break a window." The group began moving cautiously, flashlights flickering in and out as they retraced their steps through the labyrinth of hallways. Every room seemed to shift subtly, like the walls themselves were breathing, changing. Shadows twisted and stretched across the floor, elongating as though trying to touch them. Elena stumbled, catching herself against the wall. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Everyone stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly at first, a child's laughter echoed down the hallway. Nathan's stomach twisted. There were no children in the house, there hadn't been for decades. He signaled for them to move quickly, but the sound followed them, growing louder and more menacing with each step. The laughter was no longer innocent, it had a mocking edge to it, like a predator playing with its prey. They entered the West Wing, where they had earlier split from Greg and Marcus. The air here was even heavier, almost suffocating. The walls were adorned with portraits of long-dead occupants, their eyes seeming to follow the group as they passed. And then Nathan noticed something odd. "Stop," he said, holding up his hand. "Look." The portraits, they had changed. The faces, once expressionless and stoic, now wore grotesque grins, their mouths unnaturally wide, just like the figure in the ballroom. "What the hell is this?" Greg whispered, his voice quivering. "Those weren't like that before." Before Nathan could respond, the floor beneath them trembled violently, nearly knocking them off their feet. A loud crack echoed through the hallway, and to their horror, the wall to their right began to split open, as though something inside the mansion was breaking free. "We have to move," Elena shouted, panic overtaking her. She bolted forward, but before any of them could react, the floor beneath her gave way with a deafening crash. Elena screamed as she plummeted into darkness. "Elena!" Nathan yelled, rushing to the edge of the hole. Dust and debris filled the air, making it hard to see anything below. He aimed his flashlight into the void, but it was as if the darkness itself swallowed the light. "Elena!" Marcus shouted, his voice breaking. There was no response, only the faint echoes of the mansion's groaning walls. "We need to get down there," Greg said, but Nathan knew it wasn't safe. The house was actively working against them, shifting, breaking. They had to think, not panic. Nathan turned to Marcus. "We'll find her. But we have to be smart about this. The house is trying to separate us, to pick us off one by one." Marcus nodded, though his face was pale with terror. He wasn't ready to admit it, but they all felt it. The presence in the mansion, something malicious, was toying with them. "Let's find another way down," Nathan said. He took one last glance into the hole before moving forward, deeper into the west wing. Every step felt like a descent into madness. The laughter had returned, louder now, echoing from every direction. And then came the voices. Whispers, just beyond the edge of hearing. They spoke in a language Nathan didn't understand, guttural and low, but the intent behind them was clear. They were being hunted. As they turned a corner, the hallway split into 3 different directions, each one leading to a different part of the mansion. "Great," Greg muttered. More choices. Nathan felt the weight of the decision. Every instinct told him the house wanted them to choose wrong. "We stick together," he said, picking the hallway to the left. The further they went, the darker it became. The air was thick, oppressive, and it felt like they were descending deeper into the mansion, though they hadn't encountered any stairs. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The oppressive silence was more terrifying than the voices. Nathan raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and froze. At the end of the hallway stood Elena. Or at least, it looked like her. "Elena!" Greg called out, running toward her, but Nathan grabbed him by the arm, yanking him back. "That's not her," Nathan said, his voice shaking. "Look at her eyes." Elena, or whatever was standing in front of them, was grinning, her eyes unnaturally wide and empty, reflecting no light. She stood unnaturally still, her head tilted to the side as though waiting for them to make a move. Then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she spoke. "Come closer." Greg pulled free from Nathan's grip. "We have to help her. She's hurt." "No." Nathan grabbed him again, harder this time. "That's not Elena." But it was too late. The thing wearing Elena's form lunged forward, its smile stretching impossibly wide as it let out a blood-curdling scream. The hallway plunged into chaos. Chaos erupted as the creature lunged at them, its distorted form nothing like the Elena they knew. Nathan barely had time to pull Greg back as the thing's outstretched arms swiped at the air where he had been standing. The scream that came from its mouth wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural sound, a low resonance that vibrated through their bones. "Run!" Nathan shouted, yanking Greg backward as the creature advanced. Marcus was already sprinting down the hallway, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. They followed, the beast's laughter echoing in their ears as it chased them through the darkened corridor. The mansion seemed to shift again. Walls appeared where there had been none before, twisting the architecture of the house into a maze. Nathan's breath came in ragged gasps as they turned corner after corner, desperately trying to lose the thing that was hunting them. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, as if the creature was gaining on them effortlessly. "Where are we going?" Greg shouted between breaths, panic rising in his voice. "I don't know," Nathan snapped. "Just keep moving." The hallways grew narrower, the ceiling lower, until it felt like the house was closing in on them. The walls pressed in, suffocating, and Nathan's flashlight flickered, the beam weakening with each step. As they stumbled through another turn, Marcus stopped abruptly in front of a large wooden door, pushing it open with all his strength. "Here," he shouted. "Get inside." They all piled into the room, slamming the door shut behind them. Nathan quickly shoved a broken chair against the handle, hoping it would hold. The silence that followed was unnerving. For a moment, they stood there, panting in the dim light, waiting for the creature to slam against the door. But nothing came. Greg sank to the floor, his back against the wall, clutching his knees. What the hell was that? That wasn't Elena. It took her form, Nathan muttered, pacing the room. "It's using the house to confuse us, to break us apart." "We're not going to make it out of here," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "We're all going to die in this place." "No, we're not." Nathan's voice was firm, though deep down, fear gnawed at him. He didn't believe his own words. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was feeding on their fear. Nathan shone his flashlight around the room. It was a large, decrepit space, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets. Dust particles floated through the stale air, disturbed by their movement. At the far end of the room was a grand fireplace, its mantel adorned with strange trinkets, old clocks, faded photographs, and what appeared to be bones. The sight sent a chill down Nathan's spine. "This place feels wrong," Marcus whispered, staring at the fireplace. "It's like we're being watched." Nathan turned toward the shadows in the corner of the room. They seemed to shift, moving as though alive, but his flashlight revealed nothing. It was just the darkness playing tricks on them, at least, that's what he told himself. But then, the whispering returned. Low, almost imperceptible, but growing louder. Nathan could hear it more clearly now, the same guttural language that had haunted them earlier. The voices weren't coming from the hallway, they were inside the room. Greg's eyes widened, his face drained of color. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," Nathan whispered. "Stay together. Don't let it separate us." The shadows in the room grew darker, deeper. Nathan could feel something in the air, like a pressure pushing down on them. His flashlight flickered again, and the whispering intensified, surrounding them. The sound was coming from everywhere at once. Suddenly, the room plunged into total darkness. Nathan's flashlight died, leaving them in pitch black. Panic surged through him as he reached out, trying to feel for the others. His hands met nothing but cold air. "Greg? Marcus?" No response. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the voices were right next to him, hissing into his ear. His skin crawled, and the air around him felt alive with movement, like something was brushing past him in the dark. "Greg," he called out again, but the whispering drowned his voice. A scream pierced the darkness, Marcus's scream. Nathan's blood turned to ice. He stumbled forward, arms outstretched, trying to find his friend. "Marcus! Where are you?" The scream abruptly stopped, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. Nathan's mind raced, heart pounding in his chest. He was alone in the darkness, the mansion's malevolent presence pressing in on him. He strained his ears, hoping for any sign of life, any sound from his friends, but there was nothing. Just the heavy, oppressive quiet and the weight of something unseen lurking nearby. Suddenly, a soft glow appeared at the far end of the room, illuminating the fireplace. The fire, which had been cold and dead, now flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the dim light, Nathan could see them, figures, distorted and grotesque, their forms barely human, moving toward him. He took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figures didn't speak, but their movements were deliberate, slow, as if savoring the moment. One of them, the tallest, stepped into the firelight. Its face was twisted into a horrible smile, wide and unnatural, just like the creature that had taken Elena's form. "Nathan," a voice whispered from behind him, cold and mocking. He spun around, but there was no one there. "Nathan," the voice repeated, closer this time, directly in his ear. He bolted toward the door, ripping the chair away and flinging it open. Without looking back, he ran into the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The house groaned again, as though alive, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The mansion wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a living thing, and it wasn't going to let them go. Nathan sprinted down the hall, his breath ragged, until he found a small side door leading to a narrow stairwell. He threw it open and ascended, the stairs creaking beneath his feet. The further down he went, the colder it became. The whispers followed him, echoing in the narrow space, growing louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, Nathan found himself in the basement, a vast, empty space with stone walls and a dirt floor. The air was damp and foul, like something had been rotting down there for years. In the corner of the room, he saw them, Greg and Marcus, huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. But something was wrong. They weren't moving. Nathan's stomach churned as he approached them, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Greg? Marcus?" No response. Their bodies were stiff, rigid, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. It was as if they had been turned to stone. The realization hit Nathan like a sledgehammer. Whatever was in this house, whatever had taken Elena, had already claimed them. And now it was coming for him. The air in the crypt felt like it was thickening with each passing second, pressing against their skin, making every breath harder to take. The dead had risen, no longer bound to the graves that had held them for centuries. Now, they moved with purpose, their hollow eyes focused on the living intruders who had violated their eternal slumber. Ethan's mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a plan. There was no going back. The tunnel behind them had collapsed under the weight of the spirit's fury. The only way was forward, but forward meant facing the full wrath of the condemned. "We need to move, now," Ethan hissed through gritted teeth, his body shaking from adrenaline. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and pulled her toward the back of the crypt, where the stone symbols glowed faintly against the ancient wall. But before they could move far, a deafening crash echoed through the chamber. From the ground, the skeletal remains of long-dead criminals emerged, their fingers clawing through the dirt. Their hollow eyes burned with rage, their mouths twisted into grotesque sneers as they crawled toward the group with horrifying speed. Lauren gasped, stumbling back as one of the creatures lunged at her, its bony hands inches from her leg. She barely managed to jump out of the way, but Chloe wasn't so lucky. A cold, skeletal hand wrapped around her ankle, pulling her violently to the ground. "Chloe!" Ethan screamed, diving toward her, his hands grasping her wrist. He pulled with all his might, but the dead were stronger. Chloe's eyes widened in terror as she felt herself being dragged into the abyss, the cold touch of the undead sending icy shivers through her entire body. "Don't let go," she cried, her voice breaking with fear. Ethan held on for dear life, his muscles burning as he tried to free her. "I won't," he shouted, his voice raw from panic. But as the dead swarmed closer, their numbers overwhelming, it became clear that they would not leave without taking someone with them. "Ethan! We can't fight them all." Lauren screamed, her eyes darting around the room for any possible escape. But there was none. The spirits were closing in, their twisted faces mere feet away. With one final pull, Ethan yanked Chloe free from the skeletal grip. She fell into his arms, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. But there was no time to rest. The spirits were relentless, and the room had become a sea of death, the ground shifting under their feet as the dead rose. "We have to get to the altar," Lauren said, her voice hoarse with desperation. "There's something about those symbols. They're different from the others." Ethan didn't hesitate. With Chloe in tow, he bolted toward the altar, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the cacophony of voices surrounding them. The dead seemed to sense their intention, their movements growing faster, more aggressive as they tried to block the trio from reaching the shrine. "Faster," Ethan urged, pushing Chloe forward as they scrambled over bones and broken stone. Lauren was close behind, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Just as they reached the altar, a massive spirit, larger and more grotesque than the others, emerged from the shadows. Its body was a twisted mass of rotting flesh and bone, its eyes burning with hatred. It let out an unearthly wail that shook the entire crypt, sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. "Get behind me!" Ethan shouted, his voice filled with determination. He grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the ground, a broken piece of one of the ancient tombs, and held it in front of him, as if it could somehow protect them from the abomination before them. The creature lunged, its claws outstretched, but just as it was about to reach them, a sudden light erupted from the altar. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow, brighter and brighter, until the entire room was bathed in an eerie, pulsating light. The spirits recoiled, their movements slowed as if they were being repelled by an invisible force. "What's happening?" Chloe gasped, shielding her eyes from the blinding light. Lauren's eyes widened as she studied the symbols. "This altar, it's a seal. It's been holding them here. But now it's breaking." Ethan's mind whirled as he tried to comprehend the situation. The altar had been the source of the spirit's imprisonment, but now that they had disturbed it, the very force that kept the dead at bay was failing. If they didn't act quickly, the condemned souls would be free to roam the world above, wreaking havoc on anyone they encountered. "We need to restore the seal," Ethan shouted over the growing cacophony of voices. "But how?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Lauren stepped forward, her hands shaking as she traced the symbols with her fingers. "These markings, they're not just decoration. They're part of a ritual. If we can figure out how to activate them, we might be able to trap the spirits again." Ethan's mind raced as he glanced around the room, searching for any clue that might help them. His eyes fell on the bones scattered around the altar, remains of the very criminals who had been condemned to this fate. "We need something from the dead," he muttered, piecing the puzzle together. "Their bones, they were part of the seal." Chloe's face paled. "You mean, we have to put them back?" "It's the only way," Ethan said, his voice grim. "If we don't, the dead will be free to take their revenge." Without another word, the three of them set to work, scrambling to gather the bones that littered the floor. The spirits, those slowed by the light, still moved toward them with unrelenting fury, their hollow eyes locked onto the living. Ethan threw bones onto the altar, matching them with the symbols etched into the stone. The light from the altar grew brighter with each bone placed, the air around them buzzing with energy. But the dead were closing in fast, their twisted hands reaching for the group. "Faster!" Lauren screamed, her hands trembling as she placed the final piece onto the altar. With a deafening roar, the altar erupted in a blinding flash of light. The spirits let out anguished screams as they were pulled back toward the earth, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The ground shook violently as the crypt began to collapse around them. "We need to get out of here," Ethan shouted, grabbing Chloe and Lauren by the arms as the ceiling crumbled above them. They sprinted toward the exit, dodging falling debris and crumbling stone. Behind them, the crypt continued to implode, the walls cracking as the spirits were forced back into their graves. The light from the altar flickered one last time before dying out completely, leaving the chamber in complete darkness. Then he saw it, half buried in the pile of bones, a small, old-fashioned iron key, glinting faintly in the dark. Nathan's trembling hand closed around the cold iron key, its weight feeling impossibly heavy for such a small object. He had no idea what it unlocked, but something deep inside told him it was important, perhaps even his last hope. Behind him, the slithering sound grew louder, closer. He could almost feel the breath of whatever creature was following him, could sense its hunger, its rage. Every instinct in Nathan's body screamed at him to run, but the small chamber was a dead end. The only way out was the way he came in, or whatever door this key could open. He spun around, scanning the chamber once more. His heart was pounding in his chest, the pulse in his ears drowning out all but the relentless approach of the thing in the tunnel. The bones scattered around the room seemed to shift underfoot as if they were alive, creaking and rattling in the stale air. Then he saw it, a small, iron door, almost hidden in the far corner, barely big enough for him to crawl through. Without thinking, Nathan ran toward it, his fingers fumbling with the key as he reached the lock. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped it twice, each second feeling like an eternity as the creature's guttural growl echoed through the tunnel behind him. He shoved the key into the lock, twisting with all his strength, praying it would fit. Click! The door creaked open with a loud groan, and Nathan dove through, slamming it shut behind him just as the creature burst into the chamber. He could hear it scratching at the door, its claws raking against the iron, its low growls reverberating through the small space. Panting heavily, Nathan leaned against the door, trying to steady his breathing. The tunnel he had entered was even smaller than before, and the air felt thick with decay. His flashlight flickered again, barely illuminating the way forward. But he couldn't stop. Whatever was on the other side of that door wouldn't give up so easily. The tunnel stretched ahead, twisting and turning in ways that made it feel endless. The walls pressed in on him, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees. He could still hear the creature behind him, its angry growls growing fainter as he moved deeper into the darkness. But the feeling of being hunted never left him. As he crawled, Nathan's mind raced with questions. Who had built this tunnel? Why was there a key hidden among the bones? And what was that thing? His thoughts kept returning to the mansion itself, the strange history that had been whispered about but never fully explained. The deaths, the disappearances, the malevolent force that seemed to linger in every shadow. Was this house some kind of prison for the dead? A gateway to something darker? He couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain: whatever had claimed the lives of Greg, Marcus, and Elena wasn't done with him yet. After what felt like an eternity, Nathan reached the end of the tunnel. Ahead of him was another door, this one larger and covered in strange, ancient symbols. His flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows over the carvings. They looked like runes, though he couldn't make out their meaning. But something about the door felt familiar, like it was calling to him. Nathan hesitated. The scratching from the creature had stopped too suddenly. An eerie silence filled the space behind him, and a chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. Before he could react, a deafening roar echoed from the tunnel behind him, and the sound of crumbling rock filled the air. The creature had found another way through. Without a second thought, Nathan pushed the door open and stumbled into the room beyond. His flashlight blinked out, plunging him into total darkness. The air here was colder, more oppressive than anywhere in the house. The stench of rot filled his lungs, making him gag. And then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. Like footsteps, but slower, heavier. "Who's there?" Nathan's voice cracked as he fumbled to relight his flashlight. When the beam of light finally flickered back to life, it revealed something that made his blood run cold. The room he had entered was massive, much larger than the cramped tunnel he had just crawled through. Its walls were lined with strange, ancient stone altars, each one adorned with a single object, a relic, or a piece of something unidentifiable. But it was what stood in the center of the room that made his heart nearly stop. It was a figure, hunched and twisted, cloaked in darkness. Its long, skeletal arms dragged on the ground, and its face, if it could even be called that, was a writhing mass of shadow and teeth. It turned slowly toward him, its glowing, hollow eyes locking onto Nathan with a hunger that sent ice down his spine. Nathan stepped back, nearly tripping over his own feet as the creature began to move toward him. It was slow, but every step it took made the ground tremble beneath him. He could feel the air growing colder, the oppressive weight of the room closing in on him. He was trapped. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. He scanned the room frantically, but there was no other door, no escape route. His only chance was the key. Fumbling in his pocket, Nathan pulled out the iron key again. His hands shook as he glanced at the symbols on the door. They looked similar, too similar. The key had to be connected to this place. But how? The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its steps growing faster, more urgent. Nathan's heart pounded in his ears as he backed up against one of the stone altars, desperately trying to figure out what to do. His flashlight flickered again, casting wild shadows across the walls. Suddenly, one of the relics on the altar caught his eye, a small, ornate box, covered in similar runes to the door. His pulse quickened as he realized what he had to do. The key wasn't for the door, it was for the box. With trembling hands, Nathan jammed the key into the lock of the box and turned it. The box clicked open, revealing a small, blackened stone inside. The second he touched it, the air in the room shifted. The creature stopped, frozen in place as if something was holding it back. But the darkness around the stone seemed to pulse, alive with energy. Nathan could feel it thrumming in his hand, almost as if it was pulling him towards something. The walls began to shake violently, and the floor cracked open beneath him. He had no choice. Clutching the stone, Nathan ran back toward the door, praying that the creature wouldn't follow. But as he turned back for a final glance, the thing raised its head, and with a roar that shook the entire mansion, it lunged toward him faster than he thought possible. Nathan barely made it through the door before slamming it shut behind him, the creature's deafening growl echoing through the small space as it crashed against the other side. He collapsed against the wall, his entire body shaking from adrenaline. The key was still in his hand, the stone pulsing with an eerie energy that made him uneasy. But for now, he had escaped. Or so he thought. Nathan woke up in a cold sweat, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. He had passed out in the study, his mind unable to bear the weight of the horrors that plagued him. The once grand room felt smaller now, the walls seeming to close in. His mind raced as he tried to remember everything he had learned so far. That key, the strange artifact, the symbols on the walls, it all felt connected. There had to be something more hidden here, something that explained the deaths that haunted the mansion. His team was gone, consumed by the darkness that resided in this cursed place. He felt a surge of guilt, wondering if he was the next to fall. But there was one last place to search, the attic. The one room that had remained locked, its entrance hidden behind layers of debris. Nathan forced himself to his feet, gripping the key he had found. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for him all along. He made his way through the mansion, each step heavy with dread. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, like a maze meant to trap him. As he approached the attic door, he felt the air grow thick, as if the very essence of the house was trying to stop him. His hand trembled as he inserted the key into the lock, but it turned easily, almost welcoming him inside. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a sliver of moonlight that filtered through a broken window. Dust swirled around him as he stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. At first glance, it appeared to be just another forgotten room filled with old furniture and discarded memories. But in the corner, covered in cobwebs and hidden beneath an old sheet, Nathan found something that made his blood run cold. It was a mirror. But not just any mirror, this one seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its surface warped and twisted. He felt an overwhelming urge to look into it, though every instinct screamed at him to run. As he stepped closer, he could see faint reflections moving in the glass, though they did not match his own movements. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted, and Nathan felt a presence behind him. He turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling grew stronger, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around him. "Help us," a voice whispered from the darkness, sending chills down his spine. Nathan staggered back, his mind spinning. He recognized the voice. It was Anna, one of his team members. But she was gone. Dead. "Help us, Nathan," more voices joined in, echoing through the room, filling his head with their tortured pleas. The mirror began to vibrate, and from within its depths, Nathan saw them. His team, Anna, Jake, and Marcus, trapped in the glass, their faces twisted in agony. He stumbled back, horrified as their spectral forms reached out to him. This can't be real," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. But it was. The mirror was more than just a reflection. It was a prison. The spirits inside screamed, their faces distorting into grotesque, hollow-eyed masks of despair. Nathan felt a wave of terror wash over him. He had come here seeking answers, but he was now standing in the epicenter of the mansion's darkest secret. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. The house seemed to awaken, its walls groaning, and a deep, guttural sound rumbled through the attic. The mirror cracked slightly, and the spirits trapped inside let out an unearthly wail. "You're part of this now," Anna's voice whispered, but it no longer sounded like her. It was darker, more malevolent. Nathan realized too late what was happening. The spirits weren't pleading for help. They were calling him to join them. The mirror glowed brighter, pulsating with dark energy. The cracks spread across its surface, and as Nathan backed away, he realized the truth. The mirror was feeding off him, pulling him toward it. With every step he took, he felt his strength waning. The weight of the house's curse pressed down on him, draining him. The mirror wasn't just a prison for the spirits, it was a doorway, and Nathan was standing at the threshold. "Don't let them take you," he muttered to himself, but the words felt hollow. The room darkened, the shadows swirling in chaotic patterns around him. He was trapped, just like his team. He reached for the artifact in his pocket, the strange, ancient relic he had found earlier. In a moment of clarity, he understood. The artifact was a key, not just to the attic, but to breaking the curse. It was the only thing that had resisted the dark pull of the house. With the last of his strength, Nathan held the artifact toward the mirror. The energy from the relic clashed with the mirror's dark aura, causing sparks of light to flicker through the room. The mirror screamed, the sound a deafening cacophony of tortured souls. But it wasn't enough. The mirror shattered, the glass exploding outward in a burst of cold, supernatural wind. Nathan shielded his face, the shards cutting into his skin. When he opened his eyes, he saw the spirits of his team standing before him, their faces serene for the first time since their deaths. "Thank you," Anna whispered, her voice soft and genuine. Nathan nodded, tears welling in his eyes. But as the spirits faded, he realized something was wrong. The house wasn't done with him. The walls began to close in, the darkness around him growing thicker. The mirror may have been destroyed, but the evil that had plagued the mansion for centuries was still alive, and now it had its sights set on Nathan. He could feel it, crawling into his mind, wrapping itself around his soul. He tried to fight it, but the energy was overwhelming. The last thing Nathan saw before the world went black was his own reflection in the shards of the broken mirror, his face twisted and hollow, just like the spirits before him. Years passed. The mansion remained abandoned, its dark reputation growing with each generation. Locals whispered about the horrors that had occurred there, warning others to stay away. But the house waited. And deep within its walls, in the very attic where Nathan had met his fate, a new mirror had formed. Its surface was dark, cracked, and warped. And within it, the faint image of a man could be seen, his eyes hollow, his mouth open in a silent scream. Nathan had become part of the house now, forever trapped in the reflection. The mansion had claimed its newest guardian, and it was always hungry for more.